Good evening. Good evening, and thank you for being here. I had assured our panelists that neither rain, nor hail, nor quaking of the ground would keep my constituents from being here this evening. So you have proved me true. Thank you so much for being here. I'm County Supervisor Joe Simitian, and my office is honored to host tonight's program along with the City of Mountain View's Human Relations Commission. I want to extend a special thanks to the City of Mountain View and to the city staff for hosting us here in the Center for Performing Arts. How about a thank you or applause to them? And let me just say right now, either with or without the microphone, let me just say right now that I very much hope you'll join us for our next two Understanding Islam programs coming up next Monday. That's April the 23rd, and on Monday, April the 30th. In your places, as you walked in, you should have a question card. Can you all hold up your question cards so that we can see that you have them? Great. We ask that you write your questions on the question card because there will be time during our panel discussion tonight for your questions. And we're going to ask that you write as clearly as you possibly can. If you have a question and you've written it down on your card, just raise your card in the air as you did a moment ago, and one of our staff members or a member of the Human Relations Commission will come by and collect it. Let me also ask that your questions this evening focus on tonight's topic, if at all possible, which is understanding Islam. What does it mean to be Muslim? The basics. As I think I have shared with you, our next two programs will focus on women and those issues in depth at that time. Our conversation this evening is being taped by our friends at KMVT for broadcast at a later time. So let me just ask that all of us find our cell phones and make sure that they are turned to silent or turned altogether off. And whether it's a cell phone or some other mobile device, whatever it is, if it beeps, buzzes, rings, or pings, if you could turn it off at this particular time, that will ensure us an uninterrupted conversation. And thank you, panelists. Now, on to the program. The one other thing I should say is, if you haven't already had a chance to do so, please take a look around, and in the unlikely event of an emergency, make sure you know where the nearest exit is. This is an announcement required by law, and I just want to make sure everybody knows where those green signs and the exits are in the unlikely event you need to vacate the place. All right. In my view, we are lucky to live in one of the most diverse places in the country. But without understanding the diverse cultures amongst us, misconceptions abound. So our goal tonight is really very simple, and it is to create a better understanding of Islam among the general public. I want to begin by introducing tonight's panelists. At the far end of the stage from me is Anita Hussain. Anita is the Associate Dean and Director of the Markaz Center at Stanford University. Before she joined us here in the area at Stanford, Anita was a lecturer in the Near Eastern Studies Department at Princeton University. And prior to that, she worked in the Arabic programs at both the University of Texas, Austin, and at Georgia State University. Anita received her BA in Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies from Emory University, spent 2 years in the Peace Corps as a volunteer in Morocco, and then received her MA in Arabic Studies from the University of Texas at Austin. Also with us tonight, Jihad Turk, who is seated in the middle, and you heard that name right. It is Jihad Turk. Jihad is the president of Bayan Claremont's Islamic Graduate School. He received his undergraduate degree in history and Arabic from UC Berkeley and his master's degree in Arabic and Islamic law from the University of Texas. He also co-founded the Muslim Christian Consultative Group and the Greater Los Angeles Muslim Jewish Forum. Finally, we have Maha El-Junaidi. Maha is the executive director and founder of the Islamic Networks Group. She received her undergraduate degree in political science and economics from the American University in Cairo, and her master's degree in religious studies from Stanford University. Maha has been recognized with numerous awards, including the Civil Rights Leadership Award from the California Association of Human Relations Organizations. Please join me in giving a welcoming round of applause to our three panelists, Anita Hussain, Jihad Turk, and Maha El-Junaidi. In order to facilitate a somewhat more conversational style, I'm going to step out, but not into the pit. And we're going to jump right in with sort of a threshold question for all three panelists. And we're going to try and make this as conversational as we can. And as I have said to the panelists, just act like it's a living room conversation with 450 of your closest friends who happen to drop by, okay?
And the lights.
So, what do Muslims believe? I'm familiar with the fact there are 5 pillars of Islam, but let's start there. What do Muslims believe? Who'd like to begin? Maha?
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Joe, for doing this again. And the fact that all of these people are here, as many as last year, just sort of demonstrates the need for having this kind of conversation about Islam and Muslims. So I want to thank your office, I want to thank you and all of you for being here to have this conversation with us. So Islam, I think it's really important to point out, is a religion. It is not anything else, like a political ideology or anything that's been said about it in the media, especially in places like Fox News. Islam is a religion, and it's an Abrahamic religion, which gives away the fundamental belief, that is that Muslims believe in the Prophet Abraham and the God of Abraham, whose source and nature we don't know, but that we believe that God is the creator of everything. And so right there, we also have in common with Christians and Jews the God of Abraham. So that's the foundational, fundamental belief. Islam is a monotheistic religion as a result of that. And in addition to the belief in God, we believe in the unseen world, which would include the angelic world. We believe that this God communicated with humanity through the medium of prophets that were chosen by God, who were human beings, starting with Adam and Eve, and culminating in prophets that include, besides Abraham, would include Noah, Moses, Jesus, and Muslims believe there were 124,000 messengers that were chosen by God. That included women. Mary, the mother of Jesus, was one of those people that Muslims believe was also a prophet. So the Muslims believe that God communicates to humanity, to his creation, through the medium of the prophets, through messages that were contained in Scripture, in holy books. That would include the Torah, the Gospels, the Psalms of David, and Muslims also believe in the Quran, that is considered by Muslims to be the final testament revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. And Muslims also believe that we are going to be held accountable in the hereafter, that life doesn't end when we die, but that it continues in that we will be resurrected and stand in the divine court of justice before God, and that we will be held accountable for our actions in this world. And that's the most important, really, thing that you need to know about Islam. Islam is an Abrahamic tradition, which explains why we have so much in common with Jews and Christians, who are considered by Muslims as Ahl Kitab, people of the book, that follow very similar beliefs and follow very similar rituals. Pillars, you might have heard.
Hang on just a second, Mahab, because I want to ask a little bit more about what many of the folks here in the auditorium would probably describe as the Judeo-Christian tradition, because I'm guessing that a significant number of folks here in the room were raised in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Not all, but many. But let me also just do a double check on sound in the back. Can you hear us loud and clear in the back of the room? No, thank you. All right. So we're both going to ask our panelists to speak up a little bit, and we're also going to ask our tech crew to help us out a little with the volume, if you could, please. Okay. So
now we can hear you.
There you go.
So Maha, can you repeat everything you just said?
No. So to where are there areas, if any, that are in common or that overlap with what is often described as the Judeo-Christian tradition? And where are there areas of departure just in terms of what the faith entails?
So, could I jump in
Please,
here?
go ahead.
All right. So I'm going to say what she said, but in answer your question directly in a third of the time, or less. As close as Christianity and Judaism are to each other, Islam is right in the middle between the two. closer to Christianity than even Judaism, and closer to Judaism than Christianity is.
In what way?
In the following way. All three religions believe in one God. And like Judaism, Islam is not just focused on the worship of one God and not worshiping false idols, but also it shares with Judaism a lot of the ritual around purity, the focus on what in Judaism is known as halakha or Jewish law. We have something similar in Islam called sharia, which we're going to get into in session 3, but it regulates, not only what kind of food we can eat, we call it halal, not kosher, but very similar dietary laws, rituals around prayer, how often we pray, what is said in prayer, connection to Scripture, very much like Judaism. But unlike Judaism, more like Christianity in that we believe that Jesus is Christ, born to the Virgin Mary, inspired with the Holy Spirit. And we believe, unlike most Jews, although there's a spectrum of belief amongst Jews, unlike most Jews, there's a great focus on the Day of Judgment, accountability, heaven and hell, and also Jesus coming back in the end of times. So we're closer to Christianity in that regard than Judaism is. Where we differ from both is that we also recognize that Muhammad, who was also a descendant of Abraham, remember Abraham had 2 sons. Ishmael is the older son, his descendants became the Arabs, and Muhammad is a descendant from that lineage. And Isaac, his descendants were the Israelites, Jews and Christians both are from that lineage. And Muhammad, although from the older son, came about 600 years after Jesus and was preaching to the Bedouin desert Arabs, what's referred to in the Bible as the wilderness. And there he hearkened back to the belief of Abraham. So he came sometime after both of them, and so we acknowledge that the revelation that he brought with him is also divinely inspired. It's known as the Quran. So that's one point of difference. The other point of difference with Christians is although we recognize Jesus as Christ, we don't worship Jesus. We worship God directly, and we look to Jesus as an inspired person, an inspiration for us, a role model for us to follow in terms of how to be righteous, how to be good. So we share the same values that Jesus and that Moses and other prophets brought, but our worship is to God directly, and we don't include Jesus in the Godhead.
Thank you. And Maha, I'm going to let you be the judge of whether that was 1/3 the time or not. So, and we're comfortable with each other, as you can tell. And Anita, it occurs to me as I listen to both what is similar, same, what's different, that there's a larger question beyond the tenets of faith, which is, there's many who have suggested in the recent past that Islam is inherently or fundamentally incompatible with Western values that are based in what I'll call the Judeo-Christian tradition. Your thoughts about that? Are there parts of Islam that are inconsistent with the Western values that most of the folks in this room are probably comfortable with and familiar with?
I'll answer that question by stepping back a little bit.
Please.
And getting to the original question. So what Maha and Jihad explained in terms of the history and the doctrine is all true about the similarities and differences between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. How that plays out in sort of the lives of Muslims as compared to the lives of Jews and Christians today, I think there's one main similarity that I'd like to highlight, and that is the diversity within each community. So just like within Christianity, there are lots of different churches, lots of different interpretations of history, lots of different ways of practicing and calling yourself a Christian. And within the Jewish tradition, there's different communities and identities. The same is true within Islam. So that plays out in terms of different communities and sects. You've probably heard of Shia and Sunni. There's also Sufi traditions and Salafi traditions. There's an American-grown tradition of the Nation of Islam. So there's a lot of diversity even within the word Muslim or Islam. And I think that comes around to answer this question about, is Islam fundamentally incompatible with Western values? by saying there are parts of Christianity, there are parts of Judaism, there are parts of Islam, interpretations of all three that you could say are incompatible with democracy or incompatible with Western values. And then there's the majority of all three religions, which you could say are, have no inherent incompatibilities. And because of that reason, I think the phrase Judeo-Christian is, doesn't really serve much of a purpose. It's not a phrase that really makes sense because it assumes that Judeo-Christian is closer than anything else. And even moving beyond Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, I think most religions share more in common than they have different. And so when the phrase Judeo-Christian is used, it sometimes intentionally erases or otherizes or orientalizes the Muslim tradition as fundamentally different than Judeo-Christian. So I critique the word Judeo-Christian in the same ways that I would critique the use of the word Allah in English. So Allah is literally Arabic for God. So when Muslims and non-Muslims translate Arabic prayers to English, but don't translate the word Allah, so praise be to Allah, Lord of the worlds, instead of praise be to God, Lord of the worlds, it again otherizes Allah as fundamentally different than the Judeo-Christian God, which is really the same God as Jihad and Maha were explaining.
Right. Let me ask some quick questions, and the panel knows this, but I want to share it with the crowd. We want to make sure that this is a probing, thought-provoking conversation. So I'm going to probe and thought-provoke a little. I was asked last year, and it came up again this year, are you going to have somebody present the other side? And which raises an interesting question, which is how do you present, quote, the other side of a set of religious beliefs? But I want to ask some quick questions because our experience last year tells me that these questions are out there. Let me ask, where were all three of you born? Very quickly, right down the row.
Minneapolis, Minnesota.
I'm an American kid from Arizona.
Okay.
Cairo, Egypt.
Are all three of you American citizens?
Yeah.
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 Okay. Let me ask this question. Is there anything inherent in Islam that would give you pause when it came to standing and doing the Pledge of Allegiance?
No.
No.
Okay.
No.
Not at all.
Is there anything about Islam that would give you pause when someone said, are you a patriotic American?
No.
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 Is there
Very easy.
anything inherent in Islam that you think sets you apart from the 450 people who are in these chairs?
No.
Not at all.
Okay.
Nope.
Although they may not view us that way.
Are we speaking up, please, again? Thank you.
Although a lot of people sitting in the audience, I'm thinking, probably would not view us that way, that we have a lot in common with them. I think that that's what I come across all the time, is that people see us as the other, as foreigners, and that Islam is an alien religion, if you think that it is a religion, or a political ideology, or something else. I come across that all the time. I do a lot of speaking, and yeah, but that's not our perspective, obviously, towards the audience.
Well, let me ask this question. Again, many of the folks in the room were raised in the Judeo-Christian tradition, if that's a phrase we can use for a moment, in the absence of another. And so they're familiar with perhaps with what happens in their church or their temple. What happens in a mosque?
The same thing that happens in most churches and most synagogues. It's first of all, it's
Now, that would mean that little kids behave badly when they should be paying attention,
Absolutely.
just to be clear. So.
I certainly did when I went to Sunday school.
Okay.
But you know, it's a place where the 5 canonical prayers are established and performed in the mosque, and so the mosque essentially serves that primary purpose as it does the place of congregational prayer that Muslims perform on Friday at noon, which would be the same as you know, Sunday morning congregational prayers for Christians, and Friday night and Saturday morning Shabbat services for Jews. So it has that primary purpose, but it's also a community center where lots of activities take place. So you have youth and adult classes. You have Sunday school. We actually call it Sunday schools or weekend schools that either happen on Saturdays or on Sundays. You have youth programs. You have women's programs. You have banquet halls for events in the evening. All sorts of things happen inside the mosque in the United States, which acts as a community center. You have a library. Some of the bigger mosques have a health club, teaching yoga classes and all sorts of other types of classes. So it really depends on the mosque, the size of the mosque, the capacity of the community, the resources that are being put into the facility, and so forth. It's very similar, I think, to synagogues and the churches that I've been to.
So you mentioned, if I had the phrase right, Maha, congregational prayer, I believe is the phrase you used.
Right.
And I'm gathering that that is distinct from the individual call to prayer that is answered 5 times a day outside the mosque as part of the faith. Jihad, so what does that 5 times a day call to prayer entail, and what is its significance? And trying to help make this relevant to the daily experience that we all have, what does that entail for a Muslim American who may find that his workplace or his school is not structured around the 5 daily calls to prayer?
Yeah, so as Muslims, we are asked by God to express our gratitude and to pray, not just to express gratitude, but to ask God for help in whatever difficulties or challenges we might be facing, to pray to God for world peace, all of the things that you would normally pray for in whatever faith tradition you follow. We're asked to do it 5 times a day. And each prayer lasts about 5 minutes. It's not very arduous. We do wash beforehand, and we do orient ourselves towards the sanctuary built by Abraham.
And excuse the interruption, the washing for prayer is?
It's like a ritual washing where we just kind of put water on our face, our hands, wipe our hair.
And the reason for that is?
It's to prepare us psychologically, to not only be physically be clean, but to prepare us psychologically to enter into an important conversation with God. So we wash ourselves, which just gets us into the mindset. We orient ourselves towards the sanctuary built by Abraham, which is the Kaaba in Mecca. Him and his older son Ishmael built it some 2,500 years ago, and it's still there today. And we direct ourselves in that direction, all individually or when we're collectively praying, or all around the world, we face that same direction, and then we engage in kind of like Muslim yoga. There's some bowing, there's some prostrating, and there's no imagery, that we don't try and picture God. We pray looking down, but knowing that God is perceiving us. And it's a very centering activity because it just kind of puts everything in perspective, gives you a sense of inner peace and calm, and then you go on with your day. So the 5 times are before sunrise in the morning, so dawn, midday, mid-afternoon, just after sunset, and just after dusk is finished. So each of these times, 5 minutes, you find a quiet place to do that. Sometimes, the early morning and the late at night, not a problem. The midday, mid-afternoon, sometimes you're at work, and it's difficult to find a place, depending, you could be out and about. And I remember when I was a student at Berkeley, and I went to my first Giants game, baseball, and so we went to the stadium, and baseball games are long. And although we have a window of time between noon and afternoon to make the prayer, the baseball game was taken up that whole time. And so a group of my friends that went with me to the game, we said, let's go find, during the 7th inning stretch, go find a place to make the prayer. And there's not a lot of just open space in the stands there. So we went towards one of the exit tunnels, and we took 5 minutes, and we gathered, not blocking the way, and we did a quick prayer. And as we're bowing, I remember distinctly there was a fan who had imbibed some liquids that affected the coherence of their speech. So, and this was the time when you could still smoke back in the day. So I remember she came up to us, and we were all bowing down, and she's like, "Oh, are you guys okay? What's going on? Do you need help?" And so she hung around until we finished our prayer, and we tried to keep the concentration and finish the prayer. It's a short prayer, and then we had a nice conversation with her. I'm not sure how much she retained, but you'll find Muslims praying at the amusement parks and at school or at the office. And
Anita, before I come to you, let me ask Anita. You're working at Stanford, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
You're working with a lot of students of university age and with millennials. I mean, is the experience much the same for them? Do they honor the call to prayer 5 times a day in the same way? Is it a different experience generationally? What can you share about that experience?
I think that what is different for Muslim youth, I'm going to take it in a different direction. So Maha, is there an anecdote you wanted to say about prayer before I go there?
I just wanted to say that after 9/11, it's become actually quite difficult for Muslims to do prayers in public spaces. So I was going to talk a little bit about the things that Muslims experience in public around Islamophobia. And the result of that is that Muslims have become very hesitant in performing prayers in public for that reason. Even taking out, what we would call the sabha in Arabic,
Thank you. A little louder if we could get some help from our tech friends as well.
Seems to be just my microphone. Okay. All right, is that better?
There we go.
Okay. Yeah, I had it up here, but he moved it down.
There you go.
I did
All
have
right.
it up here before.
Keep going, Maha.
Yeah, so I was going to talk a little bit about that, about some of the experiences that Muslims have around, being visibly Muslim in public and performing things like the prayer or, carrying a copy of the Quran with them and reading it or using the prayer beads and so forth. I'm much more hesitant in doing that in public now, post 9/11.
All right. And again, I'm going to ask all of our panelists to speak up. We are getting some indication that it's still a little tough for folks in the back. So just speak right up.
Sure. So what's different for the college-age Muslim? Again, I'll step back a little bit and just kind of talk about what's different for college-age folks right now, and then add the Muslim layer after that. So your undergraduate years are, for many students, the first time they're leaving home, the first time they're managing their schedule. They don't have kind of like a prescribed high school course load. So they're picking their classes, they're deciding on their major, which they think is going to decide their future jobs, which is less and less true. Living outside the house for the first time, managing their time for the first time, not necessarily having that family influence about where they go, what they do, what they eat, what they drink, when they go to sleep, who they sleep with, right? So all of these freedoms come with kind of entering the college years. And then from the schools that I have the most experience with, Princeton and Stanford, there's also a huge expectation of success. A lot of these kids didn't have to work so hard to be on the top for their first 18 years of life. They were naturally kind of at the top of their class or gifted, and then they get to a place where they're just kind of average and they have to work really hard to stay afloat. So all of that can contribute to the undergraduate years really being about identity formation. Who am I? What is my purpose in this world? Who am I, as opposed to who I was told I need to be by my community or by my family? And so that's a really critical kind of moment for identity formation already. And then being from a culture where there might be a myth of being a model minority, that academics should come easily to you because you're genetically wired to be better at math or something like that, would be part of this model minority myth that some Muslims would experience.
I get that all the time.
There's maybe certain communal or cultural or parent expectations of what to major in, what to become, what kind of salary you should be making once you graduate college. And there's, in a lot of communities, stigma against mental health. So asking for help, whether it's professional counseling or even just help with some homework, help from a tutor.
And Anita, excuse the interruption, but tie that now to the issue of faith, if you
Sure,
could, please.
sure. So, okay, yes, trying to be curt. So you've got all the challenges of being an adolescent or, you know, coming of age, and then you also have a political national climate that Maha just mentioned, where there is surveillance, there's fears of reconnaissance, there's attacks on your home country, there is fears of being labeled a terrorist. And so how does that then manifest in your identity formation as a young Muslim? I've seen it go in several ways. And one compelling narrative that I think is new to this generation is that the Muslim identity, because it's sort of placed upon them, because they're getting extra checks at the airport or getting harassed for this or that or the other, feels like there's a need to reclaim that Muslim identity. And in that ways, people, more and more youth are identifying as cultural Muslims or secular Muslim or atheist Muslim or agnostic Muslim in the ways that people identify as maybe a cultural Catholic or a cultural Jew.
And again, let me just make sure I'm tracking the connections. So part of that is a function simply of that time of life and the experience. Part of that you're suggesting is a function of the current climate in the United States for Muslim Americans who are a religious minority.
Right.
You mentioned a couple of things when you're talking about all the choices and judgments young people have to make, including what they drink. Islam says what about what you can or cannot drink?
Well, generally understood that alcohol is prohibited in Islam.
Okay, and yet, so that's an issue that is confronted by young Muslim Americans then on the campus. You talked about sleeping arrangements. Islam says?
I think it's generally understood that premarital sex is frowned upon in Islam.
And yet?
And yet, yeah, Muslim students are drinking, they're having sex, they're engaging in the behaviors of most college students. Some are doing so by disassociating themselves from Islam completely and not finding that to be a salient part of their identity. And maybe joining different cultural organizations or just disassociating from even their ethnic backgrounds and their religious background. Some are saying, you know what, I'm a cultural Muslim, I'm a secular Muslim, and we see this in pop culture as well.
Now, there are dietary restrictions as well. Could you share those with the crowd, please?
Sure, so pork is prohibited, and then there are different interpretations for what permissible other meats are.
All right, so the students are eating in the dorm. You know, it was long ago, but my recollection is nobody knew what was in the dorm food, okay? So, you know, no, I mean, it's a practical day-to-day matter. How does a young Muslim American, a student in university setting, navigate that? You know, I'm guessing at some point somebody said, you know, look, I got to pull an all-nighter, let's order pizza, I'll get pepperoni. How does that play out?
That's a really good question. So I went to Emory for undergrad in 2002, and there wasn't a halal food option. At the time, I only ate zabiha meat from 3rd grade until 12th grade. I really didn't eat meat out unless it was prepared in a halal way. I got to college, I'm on a meal plan, I'm living far away from my home. It was just inconvenient, so I no longer practice that dietary restriction. Stanford students are lucky that they do have all beef and chicken in the dining halls is halal. So that option is available to
Just kosher. What's halal?
zabiha, like the Muslim kosher, basically, yeah.
All right, I want to go to some questions from the audience, and thank you for your questions. And if you have a question and haven't turned your card in, again, just raise your hand with your question card, and we'll make sure that somebody picks it up. So we have a number of questions that refer back to a conversation we had a little earlier about various channels of Islam, various paths in Islam, Sunni, Shia, etc. What's the difference? Sunni, Shia? Let's start there. Maha, go ahead.
Sure. So I wanted to regurgitate what Anita was talking about earlier about the diversity among Muslims. There are about 2 billion Muslims around the world. living in about 57 Muslim majority countries with their own histories, their own culture, their own everything. And so the diversity it absolutely exists. And I think that when we talk about Islam, it's very problematic, because which Islam are we talking about? And it's really reflected in how Muslims understand it and how Muslims practice it in different countries, in different communities, and when you take into consideration level of education, and all sorts of issues, mental health issues, family upbringing, economic class, and so forth, this is where you get the diversity. You don't have a monolithic Islam. You don't have monolithic Muslims. We represent a diversity of American Muslims, which are also cultural Muslims, because we're very much impacted by the political environment in which we live, the time that we're living in, post 9/11, and all sorts of issues that has impacted how American Muslims view Islam. Sunnis and Shias are just part of that diversity. The vast majority of Muslims are Sunni, a minority are Shia, and their differences really depends on who you're asking. Sunnis have a different opinion about where they differ from the Shia. The Sunnis would say that the division happened 60 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, and it comes about after a battle that takes place, and that's when the Shia sects, the Shia sect forms. The Shia would say, no. The distinction between the two actually takes place immediately after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, when his cousin was denied authority and denied leadership of the Muslim community. Sunnis would say also that the differences are very minor. They have the same beliefs. They have the same practices. The source and nature of the difference is political. The Shia would say no. The differences are actually theological and doctrinal, and there are major differences, between the two. So it depends on who you're asking and which Shia, which Sunni that you're talking about. Hopefully, I've complicated the issue.
No. Is it just coincidence? And I don't mean to be flipped by asking this. Is it just coincidence that, as you described it, the majority, the Sunni majority, see the differences as more minor than the minority.
Not all Sunnis, though. Not all Sunnis.
The Shias. So, all right. So there's a range of views.
There are a range of views.
Are there, in your judgment, are there significant doctrinal differences?
No.
Okay.
Speaking as a Sunni.
Okay.
All right. As an American Muslim Sunni who interacts with Shia, and the conflict that we see around the world between the Sunnis and Shia is really political more than it is
You anticipated my question.
Theological.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that, because one of the two of the questions that we have says, well, if the differences between Sunni and Shia are relatively minor, why is it that we hear so much about the conflict between Sunni and Shia?
I have an idea.
Please.
In answer to this question. If I were to ask you what are the three warring factions in Iraq, you would say the Sunnis, the Shiites, and the Kurds. What religion are the Kurds? They're Sunni. Yeah. So you have the Sunni, and the Shia, right? So why doesn't the news cover it that
Now
way?
the microphone works. Okay, there you go.
So why doesn't the news cover it as Sunni, Shiite? Well, because then it would be confusing. So I contend that media doesn't do a good job in covering religion in general, so that's why this program is so needed here. But really what's going on is you have three nationalist identities, three nationalisms going on in Iraq, and each one is competing for its own little nation state. And what you really have, you have two Arab communities that have everything in common except for the religion, and they really take almost a tribal religious identity, nationalist identity, where our tribe is Shiite and Arab, and so that's what the majority, 60% of Iraqis would adhere to. And then the 20% minority who are Sunni Arab, they used to be in power because Saddam Hussein was one of them, right? And so they kind of are bitter because the Shiite now are in charge and they feel marginalized, and so they kind of have their own perspective and want their own territory, which is on the western part. And then the Kurds, who have nothing in common with the Arabs, they have their own language, their own culture, their own history, their own territory. They happen to also be Sunni, but they want their own Kurdish nation state in the northern part of Iraq. So when media covers it, it makes it seem like it's a sectarian war, but really it's a war of nationalisms within the borders of what was a dictatorial state, but one coherent state under Saddam Hussein. So really what we're talking, and if you look at all the places in which there's conflict around the world, most of the time you can identify what's really going on there is a clash of nationalist identities struggling for either control of the state or breaking off from that. And you can take that even outside the Muslim world.
So we have we have close to 2 billion Muslims around the world,
57
in
Muslim
55
majority.
to 60 Muslim majority countries.
And then sizable minorities, like the minority here in the United States and throughout Europe and elsewhere.
And if I recall correctly, probably 85% of the Muslim population worldwide is Sunni. The remaining 15% Shia, except earlier, Anita, you referenced Sufi and Salafi. So let's just, now that we've managed to understand all of the distinctions between Sunni and Shia, not in the last 5 minutes, take us a little bit farther down this path of complexity in terms of faith. Sunni, Shia, but then Sufi is? Salafi?
Sufi is a mystical tradition. I wouldn't necessarily consider it a sect, though. I think you can have Sufi mystics, practitioners in majority in the Sunni tradition, because majority are Sunni, and then Shias as well. So it's a mystical tradition, and then Salafi is the interpretation of Islam that is
Literalist?
Yeah, that's a good way.
Yeah.
If someone used the word fundamentalist, what would your reaction to that be to describe that?
I think it's fair.
Puritanical, fundamentalist, literalist,
People
extreme
that
in some cases.
basically abandoned tradition. 1,400 years of tradition that existed throughout the Muslim world. They come along post the Enlightenment period and look around and see that the Muslim world is colonized, is in a very bad state. And so they begin to reinterpret Islam, ignoring 1,400 years of tradition that advocated and promoted freedom of religion, gender equality, all sorts of values that Americans would subscribe to. These Salafis, these new groups, begin to redefine Islam based on the context of their political environment, which was these were people that were colonized.
And for folks who are in the room who've picked up a newspaper or been watching TV and hear the phrase or word Wahhabi.
That's Salafi. Wahhabi and Salafi are pretty, yeah.
Okay.
Is a form of
It's a form of that Salafi, literalist, scripturalist, fundamentalist, puritanical understanding of Islam.
So
that ignore tradition.
I probed a little bit about why there is hostility around the world, and some of you have suggested that as between Sunni and Shia that may have more to do with politics, territory, turf.
And just to interject on this point, I would say...
I was going to differ a little bit with what you had on that
Please.
point.
You know,
Well,
that'll allow you to get the last word, so hold that thought. Go ahead, Maha.
Okay, so I think that there is, like in Yemen, for example, I'm not sure that I would consider it to be tribal or nationalist as much as I also see that the Saudis are very much, and other Sunni states are very much threatened by what they consider to be evangelism by Iran and the Shia community there, and I think that they're very concerned about that and want to keep it at bay, and so I think that there is a little bit of that. It's not just
Well, yeah, but I would say that what you have going on in the Middle East is you have two regional superpowers that have a lot of oil or gas money, Iran and Saudi Arabia, and they're nation states. And Iran is trying to spread its influence in places like Syria, we just bombed it, like Iraq, we've sent troops there, Yemen, which ironically we've supported Saudi Arabia in a war that's going on there, and they're really pushing back not so much against Shiism there, but the Iranian influence, which they see as their regional superpower. But what I was going to say about the divisions. What was?
Well, the question is, why is there so much? Why is there so much conflict? But I mean, let me ask the question.
I was going to say. I know what I was going to say. So it is really about nationalism. Before there were these nation states, Sunnis and Shias generally got along. I mean, there were so many cases, even in, let's say, Iraq, in places like Baghdad, what's the capital, where there are a lot of Sunnis and Shias living side by side, of intermarriage. So you have a Sunni and a Shia, they would get married, and their kids would be sushi. No. And I say that only half jokingly because we know people who identify that way. You know, Sunni, half Shia. But the intermarriage happened a lot. It wasn't, in so many places in which there isn't a political vacuum or dysfunctional state, Sunnis and Shias don't have that conflict, and it's only in places where you have that.
Jihad, let me ask the question this way. You're Sunni, I believe, yes? If I were to ask
yes,
you?
But I did study in Iran and learned Farsi, and I'm very familiar with the Shia
do you have
tradition.
Friends who are Sunni and Shia?
Yeah, and at the university that I head up, we also teach Sunni and Shia Islam, and we have faculty and students.
And if I were to ask you, are the Sunni and Shia, the friends that you have, all good Muslims, what would you tell me? I'm looking at you, Jihad.
You're looking at me?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, they're human, so everyone has their strengths and their weaknesses. So not everyone is all good or all bad, but yeah.
Are they equally Muslim in your view?
They're equally Muslim, yeah.
Okay.
And we pray together and behind one another.
Anita, let me ask you the same question. I'm guessing that you have friends and colleagues who are both Sunni and Shia, yes?
Yes, and I was actually raised in a Shia family. So,
and how would you self-characterize today? You would say, I am?
I would say I'm a practicing Buddhist cultural Muslim. Because I meditate more. I meditate in a Buddhist tradition more than I pray in a Muslim tradition. So I would, I'd say.
So let me ask the question, and actually the exchange with Jihad helped me a little bit, which is, would you say that Shia and Sunni are equally Muslim?
Yes.
Yeah, I think, and I think most Shias and Sunnis would say that. At the same time, though, growing up as a Shia in Sunni majority diaspora in Minnesota in the 80s, where there was like 5 mosques in the state, and so, I was, when I was hanging out with Muslims, they were mostly Sunni. There were some myths that the Sunni kids had of us as Shias, and there was some accommodations. For instance, there's different kind of places you put your hands if you're Shia or Sunni. So there were some accommodations that I was expected to make as one of the minority when I went into one of the majority mosques. So there's little minor differences you could notice in the way someone prays or when they pray. Shias take the 5 daily prayers and chunk them into 3 different times, those kinds of things.
Yeah, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this next question because to some extent we've addressed it, but just as people asked about why there was the conflict between Sunni and Shia, 2 or 3 questions ask, if the 3 Abrahamic religions are so similar, why is there so much violence and strife between and among their adherents?
So I can answer this question as well, and that feeds into my earlier answer, which is it's really about nationalism. If you took all the places in which there's conflict between quote-unquote religious groups, it's really about nationalism. And probably the best example for us to reflect upon is the example of Northern Ireland, where you have Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland who are fighting for control of the state. And what did the Catholics do? The IRA, they engaged in irregular warfare, terrorism, bombing, all of these kinds of things. That's not to be supported by Catholic doctrine. I was invited to speak at a church, and the Archbishop who invited me and spoke before me said, we're going to welcome this person who's an imam in the Muslim community, a leader in the Muslim community, and he's going to speak about what's going on in the world today. But let us keep in mind Northern Ireland and how Catholicism was invoked in the struggle in Northern Ireland to justify immoral acts, when in fact there is no moral justification. I would say the same thing exists in Islam. And just to take it even one step further, imagine, I know you're a practicing Buddhist, so don't take offense, but imagine Buddhism, which is the most peaceful religion in the world that we can imagine, was being instrumentalized by monks in the temple to encourage the adherents of a Buddhist community, majority community, to go and engage in genocide against the 2% minority population in a place like Myanmar or Burma, which is what we see going on in the world. It's a genocide perpetuated by Buddhist monks, not all, but some. So even Buddhism could be instrumentalized in an ultra-nationalist narrative to encourage people using fear and all the techniques. And we see it we see it to a lesser extent in the United States, wedge politics and identity politics, et cetera. Imagine if you had a failed state or a military state that would take over all of media and promote a certain message that would pit one group against another, that would lead to violence in the streets. Buddhism is being instrumentalized in that regard, just as Islam is in certain parts of the world, and not in other parts of the world. Like Indonesia is the largest Muslim country. You don't find any of this happening in Indonesia.
Bring it back to the United States for a minute. A couple of questions reference the notion of someone being or describing themselves perhaps as a cultural Muslim. And actually, we started the conversation tonight with my asking, what does it mean to be Muslim? What are the fundamental tenets of the faith? And Maha, you immediately talked about Islam as a faith, as a religion, notwithstanding the fact that a lot of the popular culture and the conversation is about Islam as a cultural phenomenon or a political phenomenon or an ideology. And of course, so we've talked about that. But let's go back to this issue of culture. How much of what people think of when they think about the Muslim community in the United States is the faith, and how much of it is culture? Because we've got 3 million American Muslims, more or less, and they represent a lot of different personal histories and stories. So culture, religion, can we separate the two? Are they inexorably interwoven? Anita, you want to take this one on? I'm not quite sure where I'm taking the conversation, but I'm going to let you figure that out.
Yeah. Well, I think that I'm going to step back a little bit. I like avoiding answering your questions head on. So what is culture, right? In the American Muslim context, there are folks whose ancestors have been here for several generations. There's 30% of American Muslims who are African American Muslims, descendants of slaves whose families have been here for a very long time. So their culture is African American. I've gone to mosques in Atlanta where the food served in the, like food to buy at the concession area is fried chicken and collard greens. Halal fried chicken and collard greens without the bacon bits, right? So that's certainly an American Muslim culture. I think the waves of migration from Muslim majority countries has had a very long tradition, history in this country. So I can really only speak from my own perspective. My parents emigrated from Pakistan over 40 years ago, and so they're part of the first generation of immigrants. Their understanding of culture, their understanding of being Pakistani, their understanding of being Muslim is coming from when they were in their teens and 20s back in Pakistan, right? So a different time and a different place. Then they had me and my brother were the first generation born here, no accents. We have certain privileges that they didn't have that they worked to give us, and certain access to education and whatnot. And we are very much an American culture environment. That's how we were raised. And then I look at my nephew, my brother's son, who is even one more generation removed. So I think it really kind of depends on the wave of migration, the level of the generation. And what I can say, and this comes back to that first question about the Muslims today or youth today. I think more and more we're seeing Muslims that don't necessarily fit within what other Muslims would prescribe as traditional Islam coming out and saying, no, this is my Islam. So African American Muslims bringing their black identity to Muslim spaces and bringing their Muslim identity to their Christian-dominated black spaces. We have folks in bringing intersectional identities without apology to Islam. People claiming trans Muslim identities, queer Muslim identities, bringing their own understandings of feminism to Islam that don't just ascribe a Western feminism, but are informed by the experiences that they have, and Muslim feminist women writers and leaders.
Maha?
Well, I just wanted to make sure that people understand that all of these people are American. Their orientation is absolutely American in terms of their value systems. You know, they're pro-democracy, pro-women's equality of women, pro-toleration of all religions and all peoples. They are, you know, they're rational. They're about science. So we have diversity within the American Muslim community as much as you have diversity within the American community, but their orientation is absolutely American, very much impacted by who they are. Most American Muslims that immigrated to this country are white-collar professionals, and it has to do with our immigration system. In the 60s, when Johnson opens up immigration to people from Muslim-majority countries from the Middle East.
That's been closed now, by the way.
Yeah. You know, we bring in white-collar professionals, which explains why we have so many Muslim doctors. It's estimated, I read a couple of times, that it's 10% of the doctors in the United States are Muslims. I come from a family of physicians, or they're engineers, or they're now lawyers, or they're entrepreneurs here in Silicon Valley. The number of Muslim businesses in Silicon Valley is incredible in terms of the number of people that they employ and the companies that have gone public and have made billions of dollars for the U.S. economy. And so all of those things, because we're living in also a post 9/11 environment, most of us are well educated, most of us are middle class or upper middle class. All of that makes us culturally American Muslims. We're very much impacted by culture. So that's how culture interacts with religion.
Let me go to something that is obvious, readily apparent, first impression, which is the question of attire, clothing.
Right.
So
I knew you were going to bring that up
at
some point.
At the risk of stating the obvious, what I think our audience can see, we have two women on the panel. One is covered, one is not. So we've got the questions about the hijab, we've got questions about the veil, we've got questions about the burqa. So if I were to say, Maha, you are covered, Anita is not, is that a personal choice, a cultural reference?
I sworn she was covered.
So, well, personal choice, a cultural
Right.
a choice, or a religious principle?
I definitely dress the way that I do for religious reasons, and my Islamic identity is one that is based on faith, and so the principle in dress and interaction with the opposite gender is modesty. How that's interpreted by the woman it varies. It takes on different forms.
And that principle of modesty is embedded in the faith, yes?
Absolutely. Okay. No,
Okay.
absolutely. I think that all Muslims would subscribe to the idea of modesty, not only in your attire, and also in your interaction with the opposite gender. So it takes on many different forms, and women are free to define that for themselves. For me, I take a very traditional conservative approach. I tend to be more orthodox or more traditional that way.
More Wahhabi? No.
No.
That I'm not.
Okay.
So that's why I dress the way that I do, which involves covering everything except for the face and hands, but it also dictates my relationship with the opposite gender. I can be friendly with men, but it has to be free of sexuality. So it takes on many different forms. I think that Anita is very modest in her dress. I think all of the women here are modestly dressed as well. You know, I just happen to take sort of this extra step.
Anita, your take on this?
So I think that, like doctrinally, my interpretation of the modesty code is that the biggest veil, the first thing that's mentioned in this part of the Quran is the veil of the eyes. So I think that modesty really comes from casting down your gaze, not lusting, not sexualizing the other. And so that for me is modesty. And for those that might be offended by Maha's interpretation of modesty, I would ask you, how come every billboard and every magazine ad doesn't offend you when it's a half-naked woman selling you like a carpet or something that has nothing to do with the woman's body. So I think that, you know, in my time that I've lived in the Middle East, I was in the Peace Corps in Morocco, and I studied abroad in Cairo for a year as a non-thin American woman. Those are the only times in my life I didn't have like psychological issues with food. You know, I'd never felt like I was cheating to eat a dessert or feeling guilty about things that I put in my mouth.
Which is good because they have great desserts in both Morocco and in Egypt.
It's true. You know, like never really felt, never felt fat, never felt guilty about what I was eating, never felt hyper-conscious of my body in the ways that I do in America. And so when we talk about kind of like women's liberation, I think there's the hypersexualization of the woman's body is its own captivity. And I've experienced that in my life. So
we can clap to that, right?
Sure.
Okay. So
to the answer, not to the captivity.
Jihad, so my recollection is that the principle of modesty also applies to men, yes?
Yeah.
Yes.
Is this something that you're mindful of as a member of the Muslim community?
Yeah, I try and dress modestly. I hope I'm doing okay tonight.
And does this larger religious foundation that both Maha and Anita referenced in terms of modesty, does it imbue your thinking about what Islam is or isn't?
Yeah, I agree with everything that was said.
All right.
Can I make one anecdote to that?
Please.
I think that one other thing to be mindful of is that, you know, back to the question about like religion and culture, a lot of people's beliefs and practices aren't visible. So there are a lot of non-veiled Muslim women who might practice more Islam than veiled Muslim women. So I wouldn't assume anyone is one way or another, whether they have a beard or not, or whether they have a veil or not. I have met Muslim women in Cairo wearing a veil, actually covering till their eyes, and lifting their cover to drink beer. So it's, you know, there's all sorts of...
Because they didn't want to be found out who they were when they were drinking.
There you go, there you go. So there's, you know, there's a wide spectrum, and like looks can be deceiving.
Jihad, we're going to cover in our third panel discussion 2 weeks from tonight a host of topics which we have labeled together under fear of a faith. But I cannot let the night go by without asking you about your name, Jihad. And I'm sure there, you know, is more than a story or two to share about going through life saying, "Hi, my name is Jihad," as you introduce yourself to people. But can you just tell us a little bit about...
Well, I came here on an airplane.
Yes, you did. So what is the basis for your name, if I may ask, and what's your experience going through life with the name Jihad, particularly in the last 15, 20 years?
So I was born in 1971. I'm 46 years old. And in the 70s, in Phoenix, Arizona, where I was born and raised, my mom's, by the way, is Caucasian American from Oklahoma. My dad moved to the U.S. in 1956 as a 17-year-old to Merced, California, where when he arrived, it said, "Arab boy moves to Merced to pursue life he dreamed of," all right? I'm not joking. I have the article. I took a picture of it. I have it here on my phone. So I was looking at a scrapbook just a couple of years ago, and I was visiting him. So growing up in Phoenix in the 70s, my dad named the boys. We were 2 boys and 3 girls, and my mom named the girls. My dad chose the name Jihad, and you know, there wasn't a lot of diversity in Phoenix back then. You were either black, white, or Mexican. So people just thought I had an exotic Mexican name, Jihad. That was maybe Oaxacan or something. So I kind of flew under the radar, and people didn't know what to make of me. And then when my teammates on the soccer team were calling me Jay, my dad, I was maybe 7 or 8. My dad pulled me aside and said, "No, your name is not Jay, spelled J-A-Y. It's Jihad." And remember, they passed out the roster, and it said J-A-Y Turk, and he crossed it out and made dittos. Some of you guys know what dittos are, don't you? And he handed it out to the parents on the side of the field during one of the games. And I was like, "Dad, you're embarrassing me. What are you doing?" He goes, "No, I gave you the name. It means the struggle to do the right thing. And it might be hard for people to say or remember, although everyone remembers it now. but it's worth that extra effort. And so I've always gone by jihad, and I've been very proud of it. And I've never had a problem with it. After 9/11, you would think that I would get a problem, have a problem because of my name traveling and whatnot. I never get pulled aside for extra security or anything, surprisingly, because I don't think a lot of terrorists name themselves jihad because that's just too obvious. Right? But also because I don't look very Muslim-y. I mean, I Muslimish or whatever the term is. I don't have an accent. I don't have a uniform or a dress that sets me apart. And so, if anything, people say jihad. Oh, doesn't that mean holy war? And it's a conversation starter. So I'm a little bit of a walking teaching moment. But I have to say, I don't face discrimination, hostility. Some people do, but it's usually because they racially or they look very distinctive or other. And then there's kind of a bigotry or an animosity, but I don't face that. And in fact, I'm reaffirmed in my Americanism, my patriotism, if you will, or my positivity towards what it means to be an American, because almost everyone I meet who does ask me, they're genuinely interested and want to know, just like all of you are here tonight. And it's reaffirming to say, okay, yeah, thank you for wanting to understand a little bit better and give me that opportunity to explain.
All right, more on this at our third session coming up in a couple of weeks. We have an awful lot of questions, and time is short, so I want to make sure we can get to as many of these as possible. One quick question, Maha. Are non-Muslims welcome in a mosque?
Because they've been there.
Now, I know your microphone is having problems, but I didn't think it through all the way out there. Let me try that again. Maha, are non-Muslims welcome in a mosque?
As she said, yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
All right.
And they're often there on Friday, congregational prayer to observe and to even participate, to take tours, and lots of events that are where they're invited to.
Next question. Anita, someone says, I'm confused about the difference between Muslim and Islam. Can you clarify?
That's a good question. It's a linguistic question. I'm a linguist, love this. So they come from the same Arabic root, SLM, right? It's like the word salam, salam alaikum. Arabic is a Semitic language, so is Hebrew. So the word shalom also is from that same Semitic root. So Islam, I-S-L-A-M, right? And then Muslim, the S-L-M is in there as well. So salam means peace or to surrender. And so Islam is the...
Means you better surrender to us. No.
The surrendering to God, right? Surrendering to the oneness of God. And the oneness of God, I think, is like the main theme of Islam, is that there is one God, one deity, and acknowledging that oneness is surrendering to the oneness of God. So Islam is the surrender, and Muslim is the person who does the surrendering.
So to grossly oversimplify, Islam is the religion. Muslim describes the people who are adherents of Islam.
Right. Yep.
Okay. Question. How can we support our Muslim neighbors better?
Great question.
Briefly?
A great question.
I would say three things. The first thing is come get to know us. Second thing is identify areas of common good that we can work together on helping to make this society a better place, the world a better place. And number three, when we're not there, you can then defend us when we're being sort of maligned in your circles.
Can I add to that?
Please
Because
do.
I think it's great that none of us here on the panel have experienced hate crimes, and I like Jihad, I don't experience being stopped in airports, nor have I experienced hate crimes, but I think that it's important for us to point out that Islamophobia as anti-Semitism is growing in this country, particularly after these last presidential elections, where hate crimes and hate incidences are growing by nearly 100% each year. It's alarming the number of mosques, for example, that have been vandalized. It's almost CNN had issued a report about this, and there's almost something like, don't quote me on this, but 10 a month that are being vandalized in this country. There is an epidemic of hate crimes against Muslims going on right now in the United States, and we really have to pay attention to that. If these were black churches, if these were synagogues that were being firebombed or vandalized, I think that we would have really been up in arms about it, and we would have addressed it at the national level, but it's not being addressed in the United States. And so the problem is real, it's serious. And then when I look at bullying in schools, in California alone, based on studies that have been done, 1 out of 2 Muslim kids is experiencing teasing or harassment or bullying in schools. When you go across the country, it's as high as 4 out of 5. So we have a problem there as well. So how can you help? I think that it's the question that you asked earlier about, not you, but somebody made the assumption that there's growing conflict between the 3 Abrahamic traditions. I think that there's growing friendship and growing alliances, especially since the last presidential elections, where when the Muslim ban was announced, it was Jews that were at the airports, it was Christians that were at airports, standing behind Muslims. In the call for Muslim registry, it was, it's Jews and Christians that are saying, no, we're not going to allow it. We are going to declare ourselves Muslim if this happens in the United States. And so, I am appreciative, and I know that I speak for everyone here, and the Muslim community, we're very much appreciative of the work in this effort by Christians, by Jews, and by other Americans as well. And I think I want to reinforce what Jihad said. I think this session, if it could be duplicated across the country, I think that it would really change perceptions about Islam and Muslims. And so we need to do a lot more of this education as well as interfaith engagement. And I think that the interfaith work is growing in this country. There's a movement that is growing in this country, and if you're not part of it already, you should join interfaith councils in your neighborhoods, and then also work that is being done by folks like yourself, Joe.
Well, thank you. Notwithstanding the compliment, I need to move us on. So, in case this has not yet been a lively enough conversation for you all, I think I can inject even a little more passion on the part of our panelists. Just up the El Camino at Stanford University, one of the Stanford Fellows at the Hoover Institution is a woman named Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She is the author of, I think, at least 2 best-selling books. And it is her premise that Islam is inherently violent, and she points to Muslim texts to say so. So is that the case? And if so, or if not, what you're thinking about how Islam compares with other religions in the violence or non-violence of the text. So
I can answer that one.
All right. Well, I told you they'd all
All
be
right.
interested in responding. So
Let me begin by just saying that Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I think would say that about all the other texts as well. I don't think that she just says it about the Quran. I think that she would agree that this is also probably the case, with the Bible. And so her beef is not so much that as much as, and I've read a lot of her work, and I agree with some of her critique of Muslims and Islam. I think her issue, it concerns mostly that Muslims have not, what she would call reformed, have not been modernized. And so she has more tolerance, I think, for Christianity and Judaism. I don't know if you would agree with me or not, but because she views them as having been reformed, that they actually still don't believe in the magic of religion. Whereas Muslims, they still believe in God, they still believe in revelation that was given to the prophets. They believe in a hereafter, they believe in heaven and hell. So she would say that the ethics of Islam are okay to keep, but get rid of this, what she would call magic, because it's that causes violence. The person who straps the bomb around his waist, believing that he is going to have a better hereafter or a better life than the one that he's in, is the issue. And I think that that's really her issue. The issue is that for her, Islam hasn't been modernized, and modernization for her is to get rid of revelation and the holy books and
Jihad?
And so forth.
Yeah, I understand where she's coming from, because she had a horrific upbringing and experience in her culture in East Africa, being a victim of female genital mutilation and all kinds of practices that have nothing to do with Islam, but happen to be practiced in some Muslim cultures and also in some non-Muslim cultures as an East African practice. And some Muslims still practice it, and they try and justify it through religion, although it's completely against the religion, in my humble opinion, and the opinion of many scholars. That being said, I think her animosity towards religion in general, and she is equally opposed to Christianity and Judaism as she is to Islam. She does have some particular criticisms of Islam that I think are unfounded in the way that she attributes to religion a lot of the violence, where I just, in my explanation, attribute it to other factors. And religion, even as a head of a Muslim seminary graduate school that's training imams, and I aspire to be informed by my faith in what I do, I would still argue that most people in their daily lives are more informed by culture, tribal or other kinds of identity politics in what they do, economics, other factors. And religion, even amongst Muslim majority countries, religion is really not the main motivator. It's these other things. And so I disagree with her framework for that reason. We fundamentally disagree about how the world works.
Anita, anything else to add?
Just to add that, a lot of these voices are given elevated platforms by racist alt-right organizations. So just keeping that in mind, that people have made a profession out of sort of,
hate-mongering.
Yeah.
Maha, you mentioned the word Reformation a couple of times. We have a half dozen questions about whether or not Islam is ready for Reformation, deserving of Reformation, modernization. Thoughts about this subject from any of the panelists? Maha?
I would say that it's happening. I would say that it's already happening. I see it in the students that I work with. I run a Muslim center. Of my 7 staff last year, 4 identified as queer or gender nonconforming Muslims. So, it's inevitable, and we're behind the curve, and we need to get ahead of it as Muslim community leaders, because otherwise we're just going to lose. We're going to lose our community. People are just going to run away from their Muslim identity. And I think that we have communities to look to. I think the American Jewish assimilation model is into American culture is one that I think the Muslim leaders could look to see how to address the challenges of our world. We talked about what happens in a mosque and how mosques are so similar to every other religious space. Of growing up in a family where we went to lots of different religious spaces, my parents are and were very ecumenical. The one difference, there are lots of commonalities, but the one difference between a mosque and a gurdwara or a temple or a synagogue or a church is that there's gender segregation still in most mosques, and that's something that we can't just kind of apologize or gloss over. So I think that these are questions we need to address, and we're already behind the curve in addressing them. And that's why I really commend the kind of work that Jihad is doing, training the next generation of imams, because the average imam right now is probably, if I can be a little critical of our own community, the average community leaders the average congregation is way younger than the leaders. The average congregation is American-born, but the people in power, the people on these boards, the people on the pulpits are often times first-generation immigrants that can't really relate to the American-born experience, and they're oftentimes a lot of these organizations are run by, older men that just don't get the current youth. So I think it's something we're already behind the curve on.
Let me ask one quick question, and then I want to loop back again. You mentioned the gender segregation as a concern. Mm-hmm. The rationale for that, as I understand it, is that it perpetuates the notions of modesty that were referenced earlier. Do you accept that as a credible explanation? Didn't sound like it from the tone or the reference, but I don't want to infer.
No, I think that, if you're going to a place of worship to pray, then you shouldn't be checking people's backsides out.
Okay. And you mentioned the imam We have a couple of questions about what is an imam, and also what's the hierarchy in Islam, and what is the sort of source of
Authority?
credible understanding and authority in Islam. So, Jihad, you want to start us there? So, who's in charge? Anybody?
All right, so 1/4 of the world's population is Muslim. And we are, I think I could make the case, the most disorganized, organized religion on the planet. We have no pope. That's why when something goes wrong, it's like, well, how come the Muslims aren't condemning it? Well, we are. We just don't have the bully pulpit of, Pope Francis, who I think is pretty awesome. But we don't have that one go-to person. And so you can get someone who is, espousing what we would argue is a radical ideology that's really not reflective of Muslim thinking, like an Al-Qaeda or ISIS or something else, way out there. And there's no voice in the media that counters it. Although I can say every major Muslim organization in the planet has condemned all of them. And you say, well, how come we haven't heard it? Ask your news anchor, how come you haven't heard it? You can Google it. The answer is there. But with regards to authority then, where is the source of authority if there's no hierarchical structure? Every mosque, there's 2,500 mosques in the United States, although we're only 3.5 million people, less than 1% or around 1% of the US population. Every mosque is unto itself. There is no hierarchical structure, and that's here in the United States. Around the world, every country organizes religious community differently, and there's no...
So, Jihad, if I were to walk into one of the mosques that we were talking about earlier, and I looked around and said to somebody, hey, who's in charge? What's the answer to that question?
The answer to that question is whoever formed that 501c3 and bought the building and then hired the leader could tell you, we hired this guy. What's his qualification? It varies from mosque. There's no standardization. So half of mosques don't even have an imam. The other half, so only about 44% have a full-time imam. 93% of the imams, to second what Anita was saying, 93% of the imams were born, raised, and educated abroad. And so there's a real challenge there, as she was indicating, that there isn't really a standardization for the messaging, the ideology. It's very haphazard. And so it's surprising that Islam is the fastest growing religion in America, despite all of the, sort of disorganization that exists in Islam in general and in the American Muslim community in particular. So this is why we're engaged in education in this area, because we feel like there is a need to standardize things and to try and set the bar for what it means to be a leader and to be thoughtful about not only reform, but also being relevant for the next generation.
But in all fairness, I think that a lot of Muslim organizations also rely on organizations like ING, like CARE, like Muslim Advocates.
And ING stands for?
Islamic Networks Group.
And CARE stands for?
The Council on American Islamic Relations.
Thank you.
Muslim Advocates, several other organizations. They rely on them to craft the message that is needed to speak to the public. So I don't think that they see their roles the same way that the JCRC plays that role for the Jewish community, right? The Jewish Community Relations Council, they are the public affairs arm of the Jewish community, and they become one of the many spokes bodies for the Jewish community. We have those types of organizations as well.
But I was referring to internally, not sort of outward facing.
Yeah,
so those are like representative media facing organizations.
I have a very different experience than you do in terms of the organization in within the Muslim communities. I think that in my view, is that they tend to be very well organized. Many of you have been to the Muslim Community Association, for example, the one in Santa Clara, for open houses. And, I feel that that's one of the largest, most organized. You speak all the time at the West Valley Muslim Association. They're very well organized. South Bay Islamic Association, very well organized. Evergreen Mosque, and so forth.
But they're not part of a hierarchy.
Jihad, I got to move on because
we've
got to move on because we have some. I want to get to as many of these questions as I possibly can, and then I have a final question for all three of you. So here's a question I'm going to ask, just because it struck me. When it is inconvenient to pray, does Allah give you a pass? Anita, you say?
Yes, so when you're traveling, when a woman's on her period, or when you're sick, Yeah, there
Okay.
are passes, there are prayers that are excused, there are prayers that can be made up later. So there's a lot of flexibility with that.
Next question is, tell us about assimilation. Is there a desire to be assimilated, or do folks want to be outside the U.S. mainstream?
The Muslim community is one of the most integrated, assimilated communities in the country. There have been polls that have been done about this, and they see themselves as being very much part of the American mainstream. And as Anita pointed out, Muslims have been here for some time, since the enslaved Africans. It's estimated that 1/4 to 1/3 of the enslaved Africans were Muslims. And so Muslims have been making contributions. Enslaved people contributed to the American economy through the agricultural sector, in tobacco, in cotton, in rice, and so forth. And Muslims have been coming here as laborers since the mid-1800s, and more recently, I mentioned, since the 1960s with Johnson's open door policy. And so Muslims have been contributing to the United States. They see themselves as American and very much part of the American mainstream. The vast majority of them speak English, as their first language.
Next question. What do you think of the term Islamic extremist?
I prefer the word terrorist. I mean, if they're a criminal, if they're engaged in terrorism, they're a terrorist. If they identify themselves as Muslim, I would challenge them as to the Islamicity of what they're doing. So they're just really a criminal or a terrorist.
But
and
we do have
it's not
extremist
really,
Muslims.
Yeah, you could be extreme in your practice of faith, like praying not just 5 times a day, but 50 times a day. But there's nothing wrong with that. We're talking about violence. And so if you're going to go from being an extreme worshiper to an extremely violent person, there's not really a connection there. Even though you might think, oh, the more religious you are, the more inclined you are to do violence. I was invited to the White House under Obama to participate in a summit on countering violent extremism. And what we discovered as just an attendee of that and as part of the run-up meeting with the intelligence community as to who's participating and joining ISIS and Al-Qaeda, et cetera, what they said is it's people who oftentimes don't have any Islamic foundation at all, and they just want to be part of something. And they even caught these young people going over to ISIS from Florida, teenagers, who had ordered the week before Islam for Dummies on Amazon. And so it's not that they were educated and really extreme in their religion. They were, looking for an adventure and wanting to belong and, buying into the rhetoric of ISIS. But it's not there's no connection between extreme religiosity and being a violent person or a criminal or a terrorist. It has to do with ideology. It has to do with geopolitics. It has to do with so many other factors. But I wouldn't at all equate being an extreme. You can have the longest beard and a turban and everything else. Well, you're probably a Sikh if you do that. But you could look very Muslim-y and you be the most peace-loving, kind person. It has nothing to do with the image that we imagine because of media. And I can say that having gone through that inside track of studying this issue with the people who are most expert in it in our government.
I referenced in passing at the outset, and then we veered off into a different part of the conversation, but what are the 5 pillars of Islam?
Those are rituals.
I'll say it really quickly. How about that? It's to believe in one God and to declare that belief, that there's only one God and Muhammad is one of the messengers or prophets of God. To pray 5 times a day or to pray regularly. To give charity to the poor, not to the church or the mosque. There's no hierarchical structure, as I mentioned, but to give charity to those who are in need. It's not a tithing. It's whatever you save for a year, 2.5%. So it's not even a lot. That's a minimum. And then to fast during the month of Ramadan, which is coming up in just a few weeks. You fast for 30 days. No eating, drinking, or having intimate relations.
Not for all 30 days.
All 30 days,
no.
Daytime.
Thank you.
At night, everything goes. Everything goes. And then to make the journey to the sacred sanctuary built by Abraham on the pilgrimage to Mecca.
All right.
Which,
those are the 5 pillars. So let me close with one last question, and that is this. And we're just going to go right down the row, and Anita, you'll get the last word. Maha, we'll start with you. In your experience, what's the biggest misconception that you confront about Islam and the Muslim community here in the United States? What's the biggest misconception?
That there's only one Islam, and that Muslims are monolithic, that they're all the same, they all subscribe to the same culture. And I hope that this evening demonstrated otherwise, that there is much diversity within the Muslim community in the fact that they are spread out in 57 Muslim majority countries, and even within the United States, I think that you saw a bit of diversity just among the three of us.
Jihad, the biggest misconception?
I don't think most people realize that Muslims worship God the Creator, the God of Abraham, and that Islam is not an Eastern religion. It's as Western as Christianity and Judaism. In fact, has all of the same sort of biblical figures and family. So I'd say that's the biggest misconception.
All right. And Anita?
That Islam is somehow doctrinally or inherently incompatible with democracy or Western values.
All right. Folks, that brings us to the end of tonight's program. As I mentioned earlier, we hope you will join us next Monday, same time, same place, for Islam and Women, and then 2 weeks from tonight, same time, same place, for Fear of a Faith, Understanding Islam, Fear of a Faith. I hope that you not only enjoyed but profited from tonight's program that we were pleased to bring you in partnership with the City of Mountain View's Human Relations Commission. And I hope that you will join me once again in thanking our three panelists, Anita Hussain, Jihad Turk, and Maha El-Janati. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you next week and the week thereafter. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you.
Well done.